Italian game can be played in many different ways, but in this lesson, we're going to learn how to play it in a very aggressive manner, following a specific plan that's based on castling long. Let's break it down step by step. After setting up the Italian game, Black has two main responses, one with the bishop c5 and the other with the knight f6. What's important to remember is that whenever the knight attacks the pawn, we always defend it with d3, and whenever the bishop goes to c5, we always respond with c3. In both cases, we reach this key position of the Giuoco pianissimo. In other lessons, we will look at the line where Black develops the bishop to e7, but in this one, we'll focus on the bishop c5, which leads to the main line. Here, the most common reply from Black, at all levels, is to play d6, leading to a position with a semi-closed center, because, as we can see, the central files are blocked. If you have any doubts about the relationship between the type of center and development, I suggest reviewing the lessons on opening concepts. When this kind of center is formed, the game tends to slow down, and that old idea of not moving the same piece twice becomes much less important. That's why, in this position, it's common to see the bishop move again, retreating to b3. It's important to highlight that the earlier move c3 plays a key role here, as it gives the bishop a safe retreat square on c2, and also stops Black's knight from jumping into d4, a crucial detail in White's strategy. It's also worth noting that retreating the bishop to b3 serves multiple purposes. First, to prevent a future attack on the bishop with the d5 push, and this is something to keep in mind, as we'll see its importance later on. Second, to avoid having the bishop captured by a knight coming to a5. And third, it's a subtle waiting move. Later on, we'll understand better what White is actually waiting for. At this point, it's time to talk about the plan White is aiming to carry out. So, what does this plan look like in practice? It starts with the pawn push h3, then the queen comes to e2. We'll explain later why these two moves are important. Then the queen's knight goes to d2, then to f1. We play g4, bring the knight to g3, and the king castles queenside, something like this. Try to take a mental snapshot of this setup. It'll make it easier to remember and recognize during your games. It's important to keep in mind that learning the overall game plan is much more valuable than memorizing individual moves. Now, with the center being semi-closed, flank maneuvers become much more relevant, and the king can also stay in the center a bit longer. Now that we know the plan we want to follow, it becomes infinitely easier to understand what comes next. So let's move on to the next lesson, where we'll talk about a very common strategic mistake Black tends to make in this kind of position. We'll go deeper into it in the next video. If you go for this pawn structure, it's very common that, sooner or later, your opponent brings the bishop to g4. This is the main strategic mistake in this type of position, because it actually speeds up the very plan White wants to carry out. For example, let's look at this game played by Kasparov in a simultaneous exhibition. I want to clarify that, even though there's a huge difference in level, the game is still highly instructive, because it perfectly illustrates how the attacking plan is executed. Kasparov immediately replied with h3. If the bishop captures the knight, White gets the pair of bishops, and Black has no compensation whatsoever. How to take full advantage of this type of position is something we'll explore in other lessons. For now, if the bishop went to this square, it's because Black believes the pin is strong, and most likely, they'll retreat this piece to h5. Play continues with the knight d2, and at this point, the second player should at least delay castling, or consider castling queenside. At the end of the lesson, we'll look at an example on this idea. But in this particular game, Black decided to castle right away. Now the plan continues just as we've seen. White develops the queen to e2, Black plays a6, and now, with the king still on e1, the knight reroutes to f1. White might now be threatening to continue with the bishop to g5, since this creates a pin on the knight on f6, which, with the king already castled, becomes very uncomfortable for Black. We'll dive deeper into this theme in later lessons. Black tries to prevent the pin by playing h6. But at this point, everything is ready to continue with the plan by playing g4. Notice that these two moves were carried out while gaining time against the bishop, which is now forced to retreat to g6. After that, the first phase of the plan is completed with the knight coming to g3. Once we reach this position, we can start applying serious pressure against the enemy king. Black decided to retreat the knight to e7. After that, the pressure on the castled position keeps building as white brings a knight to the key f5 square. It could have been the one from g3, but Kasparov chose to bring the knight from f3 instead. After black retreats the knight to h7, the white knight jumps to f5. If that knight is captured, as happened in this game, white recaptures with the g-pawn, opening the file for the attack. After that, the black knight returns to f6, and the rook immediately moves to g1. I wouldn't want to be in black's shoes at this point. The pressure is so intense that the king ends up fleeing to the corner. Now, how can the attack continue from here? Well, if white had needed to castle, they could have developed the bishop and castled queenside. But in this example, Kasparov didn't even need to. He simply continued with knight h5. After the knight exchange, the queen recaptures and black is completely lost. The f7 square is attacked twice, but more importantly, the deadly bishop sacrifice on h6 is looming. After knight g8, trying to prevent the sacrifice on h6, the bishop captures on f7. White not only wins a pawn, but already has a decisive advantage. After that, the black queen tries to come back and help on defense by moving to f6, and Kasparov decides to bring the bishop back to b3. But instead of that move, how could he have finished the game in an even more direct way? At this point, capturing the knight would have been completely decisive. The idea is that after the rook recaptures, you eliminate the piece that was defending h6, setting up the final sacrifice. But first, the rook enters g6, driving the queen away from the defense. Once the queen steps back, let's say to f7, the sacrifice we talked about becomes totally winning with a mating attack. Black wasn't able to stop the attacking plan white had set up in the opening, and ended up suffering a catastrophic defeat. And that's exactly why, if we go back a few moves, the bishop to g4 doesn't contribute anything to black's position. In fact, it only helps speed up white's offensive plan. But chess is a completely unfair game. What's very bad for black can actually turn out to be something good for white. Let's move on to the next lesson, where we'll understand much better what this is all about. Let's continue with this new lesson. We're going to take a look at the following position. We see the characteristic structure we've been studying, with the pawns on d3 and c3. But let's notice something important. Black is already castled, and if we look closely, this diagonal is open, so white can play a very strong bishop g5. This creates an uncomfortable pin against the knight on f6. It's one of the key concepts we need to understand well when playing this kind of structure. We're seeing this idea here with the knight already on c4, but it can also appear, for instance, with the knight still on b1, or on f1, or g3, or any other related setup. The truth is that unlike in the previous lesson, here the king is already castled, and the knight can't go back to d7 to help with the defense. Because it has already developed to c6, and the bishop is too far away to return in time. Under these conditions, the pin becomes really uncomfortable, because there's no simple way to break free from it. For example, in this game, black played h6, and of course, the bishop dropped back to h4, keeping the pressure. For now, the game continued with bishop e6 and knight e3. Notice that the knight followed a different path this time, but in any case, it's heading toward the critical f5 square. Now, if black does nothing to deal with the pin, white can just keep increasing the pressure gradually by following the plan we've already learned. For example, white can play h3 and g4, bring the knight to f5, and of course castle long, the same plan we saw at the beginning of the lesson. And that's exactly why black can't handle the uncertainty of this lasting pin, and decides to break it right away with g5. The problem, however, is that, with the king already castled, white can continue with the typical knight sacrifice. After the exchange, a piece was sacrificed in return for the two most important pawns defending the king, and at the same time, the strength of the pin was re-established, and it remains very difficult to neutralize. The game continued with king g7, trying to defend the knight and free the queen, but that won't be possible because the pressure increases with queen f3. Very often, these positions are elevated by the engine as equal, or even slightly better for black. But from a human point of view, they're extremely hard to play, especially with the king so exposed. In this case, however, the engine has no doubts. White already has a clear and convincing advantage. Black, in a moment of desperation, brought the knight back to b8, while the white knight jumped into f5 with check. A knight that close to the king simply can't be tolerated, so it gets taken out immediately, and then the queen recaptures. The other black knight moves to d7, trying to lend a hand in defense. Now, the formula for a successful attack is the same as for a good party. You have to invite all your friends. That's why white played h4, with the excellent idea that after black's next move, the rook will be able to join the attack via the third rank. The opposing queen developed to e7, and the rook immediately came to f3, increasing the pressure on the knight, which is now not only pinned along the diagonal, but also along the file, due to the threat on the f7 square. Black's king decides to move to h8, but notice that by doing so, it's no longer defending the knight. Now there are 3 attackers and only 2 defenders, so white could take back the piece that was previously sacrificed. But that wouldn't be a great deal at all, because after the exchanges, black would also capture on g2, and the advantage would be just 1 pawn, and there's no reason to give up the pressure. That's why, if we go back a few moves, white declined to win back the piece by taking on f6. Instead of that, white decided to move the king to e2. It's worth pointing out that white could have easily castled long, but with such a big advantage, the king feels perfectly safe in the center of the board. A move I personally find very pleasing to see. Black continued defending the knight with rook g6, but the pawn kept advancing with h5. If black retreats the rook and stays passive, the other white rook will join the party, with decisive consequences. So instead, black immediately decides to return material by taking out the bishop. After that, the queen recaptures, and now the material balance is 2 knights versus a rook. But we must not forget that white also has 2 extra pawns, the very same 2 pawns that once protected the enemy king. The first player is threatening a powerful check on h6. That's why the second player avoids the check by moving the king to h7. Now comes rook g3, threatening mate on g7. To defend against it, black brings the rook to g8. The game continues with queen f5, check. The king goes back to h8, the rooks are exchanged, and the king recaptures. Now white plays h6, threatening queen g5, check. So the king steps away once again. Now there's one last piece to bring into the game, so white brings it to h1. Black responds with c6. The rook moves to the third rank, while the bishop attempts to return on defense via b6. The rook then heads to g3, and after the bishop retreats to d8, it finally reaches g7. It only took white 4 moves to bring that piece, which had been doing nothing, into a fully threatening position. The f7 square is attacked twice, and to defend it, the second player pushes d5. But after the capture, notice that if black recaptures, the knight becomes overloaded. It has to defend h7 as well, so the bishop could easily take back the pawn. Because of this, black decides not to recapture, and instead plays knight c5. White then captures on c6, the 2 minor pieces are traded, and the pawn is recaptured on c6. Now we can see that the first player is 3 pawns up. But that's not all. Because of the long-lasting pin along the diagonal, black's pieces are completely passive, and the knight is still overloaded defending h7. That's why white decided to push g4, threatening to follow up with g5 and win more material. Black resigned a few moves later. This game is just one example, among many, that shows the power of this pin once the king is already castled, because, as we saw, there's no easy way to get out of the pressure. Let's also remember that after a move like g5, there's the typical knight sacrifice, as we saw in this example. But now, let's suppose we were hesitant to sacrifice the knight. Maybe we felt it wasn't the right moment, or for whatever reason, we didn't want to give up the piece. Well, that's not a problem. We can simply retreat the bishop to g3, and the attack will continue just the same, because the king is already weakened. But that's something we'll cover in the next lesson. In this new example, we once again see the typical position arising from the structure we've been studying, with pawns on d3 and c3. If we look closely, the bishop is placed outside the pawn chain, the king is already castled, and once again, we find the strong pin we've been talking about. As we've already learned, if black doesn't take any active measures, white will keep increasing the pressure with h3, g4, queen e2, knight f1, and, if needed, castling long, the very plan we're studying in this lesson. That's why black decided to immediately break the pin by playing g5. As we saw in the previous lesson, the knight sacrifice is possible, and in fact, the engine recommends exactly this move, evaluating the position as balanced. However, in this case, white, for whatever reason, chose to retreat the bishop to g3. A decision that still allows the attack to continue without needing to sacrifice the knight, as we'll see shortly. Black followed up by pulling the knight back to h7. Maybe not the best choice, but it's useful for us, because it lets us observe the attacking plan more clearly. White castles queenside, and as we can see, black's king has been weakened by the pawn push to g5, a weakness that white can begin to exploit with the advance of h4. Allowing the pawn exchange and the opening of the h-file is clearly favorable for white. That's why the second player tries to keep the position as closed as possible by pushing g4. The knight, under threat, retreats to h2. Now the g4 square is attacked twice, and to defend it, black replies with the push to h5. After this, we can see that the breaking point has now shifted to f3. And that's exactly why white decides to keep breaking down black's structure with this new pawn push. Before going any further, it's worth comparing the position of both kings to better understand the evaluations that follow. We can clearly see how black's king has become progressively weaker, while white can still castle queenside and end up in a much safer position. For example, if the pawn on f3 were captured, the queen would take back, and comparing the two kings, white's advantage would be quite clear. That's why black didn't capture, and instead chose to move the queen to f6. At that point, white captured on g4, the h-pawn recaptured, and we should also note how this pawn has now become a weakness. In fact, the first player could first trade the bishop on e6 and then capture it with the queen, giving check, with a clear advantage. But instead of all that, the player with the white pieces chooses a very human move. Perfectly in line with the plan we've been following, she develops the queen to e2. Black's king then moves to h8, and white castles long, maintaining a slight advantage. As we've already pointed out, when comparing the positions of both kings, it's clear that white's king is much safer. After this, the game went on, and the first player eventually managed to convert the advantage into a win. There's no need to analyze the endgame in detail, since it wasn't particularly instructive. What we really wanted to learn from this lesson is one specific concept, so let's go back for a moment to the key position. It's not at all necessary to sacrifice the knight on g5. It's perfectly fine to retreat the bishop to g3 and use the breaking point on h4 to continue the attack, as we clearly saw in this example. So, as we go back a few moves, we've already understood that this pin creates quite a few problems for black. That's why it's fairly common to try to prevent it even before castling, by pushing the pawn to h6. However, black also needs to know how to handle this idea properly, because otherwise they might still end up in serious trouble. We'll talk much more about all of this in the next lesson. Let's now take a look at a new example, where we once again find the typical position we've been studying. We see the moves bishop b3 and h3, within the familiar structure with pawns on d3 and c3. As for black, the bishop is placed outside the pawn chain, and the plan is to castle. But as we've already learned, the pin with bishop g5 can cause serious problems. That's why black decides to play h6 in advance. After that, white continues with the plan we've already seen, developing the knight to d2. The second player doesn't castle right away, but instead retreats the bishop to a7, another very typical move. Then the knight, with the king still on e1, moves to f1, completing another key step in our plan. At this point, black should also delay castling, because if they go through with it, as happens in this game, things could get dangerous. Castling becomes vulnerable due to the breaking point on g5, created by the earlier push to h6. If white were castled short, it would be a completely different story. But since the king is getting ready to castle queenside, the g4 advance becomes significantly stronger. Black replied with bishop e6, and now I could recommend continuing with the plan we've been studying. Bring the knight to g3, move the queen to e2, then aim for the g5 break, and of course, finish with queenside castling. But in this case, white immediately chose to go for this aggressive pawn push. And here we can clearly see the problems that arise when you play h6 and castle, while white hasn't committed to castling yet. After h takes g5, the bishop recaptures, and now what black was trying to prevent is even worse. The pin is back, and this time it's even more dangerous, since the h-pawn is gone and the g-file has opened in a threatening way for the attack. Panicking, black retreats the knight to b8, and white's rook immediately comes to the g-file. The king, trying to escape the rook's pressure, moves to h7, and the attack continues with knight h4. Let's recall the Kasparov game we saw earlier. The attacking plan is very similar. Black's knight relocates to d7, and the attack continues with queen f3. These last two moves, knight h4 and queen f3, are very important because they place the pieces on key squares for the attack. In a future lesson, focused on attacking plans when white castles short, we'll take a closer look at these two moves in particular. For now, after this strong move, black responded with queen to e8, trying to get out of the pin. White's knight could naturally continue its path via g3, but in this case, to avoid blocking the file, it chooses to go to e3 instead. Notice that, if needed, the knight could still reach the critical f5 square. After that, black continued by exchanging bishops. The recapture came with the pawn, and the black queen moved to e6, targeting the pawn on b3. To deal with this threat, the knight jumped to d5. The idea is that, if the knights are exchanged, white would recapture with the pawn, forcing the queen to retreat to a passive square on e8. That's why black avoids the trade and instead moves the rook to c8, defending the pawn on c7, which was under attack. White completes the opening plan by castling long, not only to safeguard the king, but also to bring the queenside rook into the attack. Black played c6, but after this move, the final blow against the black king came in a truly instructive way. First, the bishop captured on f6, creating a direct threat against g7, so it had to be taken. Now the knight on f6, attacked twice, is supported by the g7 pawn. But that pawn is immediately removed with a rook sacrifice, double exclamations for this move. After the king recaptures, the queenside rook joins the attack with a check on g1. Once the king moves, for example to h8, white captures the knight on f6, and on the next move, it will be impossible to stop the decisive entry of the queen to h5. As we can see, another devastating attack, the result of executing the opening plan we've been learning, and one that black wasn't able to stop. Let's go back to the key position. All of this happens when black plays h6 and castles, while white prepares to castle queenside and takes advantage of the breaking point on g5 to shatter black's kingside and speed up the attack. Now, on the other hand, we know that the best response to a flank attack, like the one white launches in this example, is a central counterattack with the classic d5 break, especially when the white king is still in the center. And it's precisely this central counterplay that black was missing in this case. Alright, let's move on to the next lesson, where we'll see how white handles this exact type of reaction. In this example, we once again see the typical position, the classic pawn structure with d3 and c3, along with the usual prophylactic moves h3 and bishop b3. On black's side, we notice that castling has already taken place, and the dart-squared bishop has been repositioned to a7. All of this is now quite standard. It's white's turn, and as we've seen in the previous lessons, the knight makes its way to f1, with the king still on e1. At this point, the first player is threatening to play bishop g5, and we already know that this pin can become very annoying. That's why black replies with h6. But as we've just learned, since white isn't castling kingside, this move is rather risky, because it creates a breaking point on g5 against black's own castling position. White immediately launches the attack with the pawn push to g4, just as we saw in the previous lesson. But in this case, black reacts a bit more actively by striking in the center with d5. If white were forced to capture and open the center, the g4 advance would completely lose its value. And this is exactly where the idea behind the move queen e2 comes into play, a move white could have played earlier or, as in this case, chooses to play now. This move avoids a possible queen exchange, strengthens central control, and with a solid center, the flank attack can continue. Now we can also appreciate the importance of having retreated the bishop a few moves earlier. Had it been on c4 and come under attack from the d5 pawn, there wouldn't have been time to play queen e2. I believe that, with all of this, the idea behind each move in white's plan has now become a bit clearer. The game continued with black trying to open up the position as much as possible by trading on e4. At this point, we already know that the g5 break is very strong, so black tries to prevent it by retreating the knight to h7. Now, based on what we've learned, the plan would normally continue with knight g3, but in this case, white chose knight e3 instead. The idea is very similar, except that from here, the knight also controls d5 and c4. Black responded by offering to trade bishops, placing their own on e6, but white declined the exchange, pulling the bishop back to c2. To keep preventing the g5 push at all costs, black continued with f6, after which white replied with bishop d2. The idea is to block the d file so that, on the next move, when black plays b5, white can castle queenside, consolidating the king's position. Later on, white continued with the h4 and g5 pawn pushes, breaking through black's castled position and winning with a fierce attack, just like we saw in the previous lesson. It's not necessary to go through the entire game, especially since it became quite complex. The goal of this lesson was to understand the importance of the move queen e2, which didn't just prepare queenside castling, but also helped deal with black's strong central reaction with d5. And I believe that idea is now perfectly clear. As we've seen, this opening plan is quite aggressive, and throughout chess history, it has brought white many victories. But now, is this plan unbeatable? Will black always end up losing? Absolutely not. Right now, we're simply studying the attacking plans that white can carry out, and which black must learn to defend against carefully. Let's move on to the next lesson, where we'll see how black can avoid all of these dangers. For this new lesson, we have a game between two very young talents. Prague from India and the Chinese player Wei Yi, played in 2019. We're going to review the entire opening phase to refresh what we've learned so far. The game begins with the Italian opening, and black replies with bishop c5. After this move, let's remember this clearly. Whenever the bishop goes to c5, the response is c3, and when the knight attacks the e4 pawn, we defend it with d3. In both cases, we reach this key position. Wei Yi continued with a6, after which the bishop retreated to b3. The game continued with d6, and white played another typical waiting move, h3. As we've seen throughout the previous lessons, the importance of this push should now be clear. Now, if black were to castle short, we already know that white could immediately play bishop g5, establishing a pin that can be quite annoying for black. That's why Wei Yi decides to prevent it by first playing h6. On his side, Prague sticks to the plan we studied earlier, bringing the knight to d2. At this point, if black castles, we already know this can become very dangerous due to the flank attack with g4, followed by g5, quickly tearing apart the king side, just as we saw in the previous lessons. But Wei Yi doesn't castle. He also plays some waiting moves and retreats the bishop to a7. White continues with queen e2, waiting for black to castle, but it doesn't happen. Instead, the light-squared bishop develops to e6. Once again, the bishop trade is declined, and the white bishop drops back to c2. As before, if black were to castle short and white launched the attack with g4, white's position would be preferable. But the Chinese player instead chooses to play queen to d7. White's knight still moves to f1, but unlike what we've seen so far, black decides to castle queenside, thereby neutralizing most of white's attacking chances on the king side. How should we continue playing in case we find ourselves in this kind of position? Well, in this case, there's no point in pushing g4 anymore, since there's no black kingside castling to break through. So it's much more natural to simply bring the knight to g3. Let me tell you in advance that in the next lesson, we'll go deeper into these kinds of positions, the ones where playing g4 is no longer a good idea. For now, after that, you could develop the bishop to e3 and go for queenside castling, which is quite solid and would lead to a balanced game with equal chances for both sides. Although, white could also start pushing on the queen side right away with b4 and a4, trying to attack the black king, followed by castling short, exactly what the Indian player did in this game, and which eventually led him to victory, even though, of course, it's a much riskier plan. The game itself is pretty long and complex, and I don't want this lesson to go on forever, so you can check out the full continuation in the light chess study, where you'll find all the backup games. For now, I think the main ideas we wanted to explore about the Italian structure with pawns on d3 and c3 are now a bit clearer. However, before wrapping up this class, I'd like to leave you with 3 exercises to solve, just to reinforce these important concepts a bit more. So, I'll see you in the next video where we'll dive into the first exercise. This first exercise comes from a position played in 1874. Mikhail Chigorin had the black pieces, but it's white to move. Here's the question. We see the typical bishop pin with bishop g5, but is this move actually beneficial for white in this specific position? Would you go for it, or would you choose a different move instead? Pause the video, take a moment to analyze, and make your decision. If you did pause and analyzed, I hope you noticed that in this position, the move bishop g5 is not advisable at all. In fact, it can even backfire because the black king is not castled. For example, black can simply reply with h6. If white captures the knight, they're just giving up the bishop pair for nothing. So the bishop usually retreats to h4. But here's the problem. Black can now play g5 without hesitation because, as we said before, the king is not castled and will actually go queenside. You can check for yourself that sacrificing the knight on g5 makes no sense at all now. It only opens lines against the white king. So the threatened bishop retreats to g3. And now comes the second problem, the one who is castled as the white king, and this bishop maneuver has actually helped black gain time and momentum, launching a pawn storm on that side of the board. Chigorin continued with h5. He's threatening to trap the bishop, and if white tries to create an escape square by pushing the h-pawn, they're just opening lines toward their own castled king. So white decided to take the pawn on g5. After all, it was undefended. Chigorin didn't care and kept attacking with h4. Even after the pawn on f7 was captured, threatening both queen and rook, he still didn't care and continued by capturing the bishop on g3, sacrificing his queen. Double exclamation marks for that move. After this bold sacrifice, he developed his dark-squared bishop to g4. Notice, f3 is not possible. The pawn is pinned. So white played queen d2. Then the knight jumped to d4, threatening a powerful check on e2. And when the white king steps to h1, black is ready to play rook takes h2, checkmate. To stop this, white developed their knight to c3, covering the e2 square. But they parried one threat, not the other. Now the black knight jumped to f3. If the king moves to h1, we already know it's mate with rook takes h2, so white is forced to capture the knight. Then the bishop recaptures, and now there's no way to stop mate on the next move. If white captures on g3, it's mate with rook h1. And if not, pawn takes h2, also mate. A true masterpiece by Chigorin, who fully capitalized on white's strategic mistake. And let's go back to the starting position of going for a bishop pin when the opposing king hadn't castled yet. Hopefully this exercise will help us remember that. Now I'll see you in exercise 2, which will also be a very interesting one. Let's move on to the next position. The question is, how would you continue playing with the white pieces? Pause the video, analyze the position, and decide what plan you would go for. If you stopped the video and analyzed, I hope you noticed that the black king is castled, but his kingside castling has a weakness on g5 due to the pawn push h6. But more importantly, the white king has not castled yet, and if it does castle, it can do so on the queen side. That's why white began a strong attack with the move rook g1, double exclamation marks for that move. The idea, which should already be familiar to us, is to push g4 and g5, break through, and of course, castle long. It's the same concept we saw earlier, the g5 breakpoint. Black tried to stop this by playing h5, but that won't work because white responds with h3. After rook e8, the attack continued with g4. If black replies with h4, trying to keep the lines closed, white plays bishop g5 and wins the pawn. That's why black instead decided to capture. After white recaptures, the g-file didn't open, but the h-file did, and that's just as dangerous. Now white threatens to keep pushing with g5, followed by g6, and notice how the bishop is already aiming down this powerful diagonal. According to the engine, the best defense here is to move the knight e7. But in a tough position, it's very hard to play perfectly, and black played queen g6 instead. That actually makes white's initiative even stronger, because now the attack continues with knight h4. The queen, under threat, moves to h7. And now the bishop comes to g5, defending the knight on h4. Notice that black cannot play bishop to e6 to interpose against the strong white bishop, because the knight on c6 would be hanging. So black plays knight d8. White immediately eliminates the knight before it can join the defense. The rook recaptures, and now the knight jumps to f5. According to the engine, the best defense would have been to immediately take the knight, even if it meant opening the g-file. But black continued with inaccuracies and played queen h2. At first glance, it looks strong, threatening mate on f2 and attacking the rook on g1. But this only speeds up their defeat. White gives a check on e7. The king moves to h7. And now, we should recognize the setup for the Anastasia's mate. If you're not entirely sure about this pattern, I recommend checking out the tactics course. White just needs to give a check along the h-file to finish the game. That's why they sacrifice the rook on g1 by bringing the queen to f3, double exclamation marks for that move. The rook on g1 was captured, after which the king moved to d2. If the other rook is taken, the game ends with queen to h3, checkmate. Now, going one move back, if instead of taking the rook on a1, black tries to trade queens by capturing on f2, that doesn't save them either, because white continues with rook h1 and its mate. So black chose to bring the queen back to h2 to cover the h-file. But after that, the rook arrives anyway on h1. Black made one last attempt, retreating the queen to h6, hoping white would capture it. But even that was not enough to save them, as white continued with a strong move g5. It is not the rook that will capture the queen, it's the pawn. And if black takes the rook, of course, queen takes h1, checkmate. Let's make sure we remember this strategy well, delaying castling and targeting the breakpoint in the opponent's king side, only to castle on the opposite flank later. This idea has led to countless successful attacks throughout chess history. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll go over exercise number 3. Once again, we have a position from Mikhail Shigorin. This time, the exercise is played with the black pieces. Yes, we've mostly been working with white, but that does not matter. Strategy has no color. White has just played g4. Pause the video, analyze the position, and try to play as the Russian champion did. I hope you took the time to pause and notice that the tactical theme is the same as in the previous pinning attack, only this time it's black doing it. But even if we know the concept, that never replaces the need to calculate accurately. Sacrificing the knight directly on g4 would be imprecise, because white can respond with an intermezzo capture on d4, giving them real defensive chances. That's why the precise move is to first eliminate the knight on c3. Once white recaptures, now is the right moment to sacrifice the knight on g4. What's the difference? There's no longer a bishop on d4, so white has no options but to recapture. After that, the bishop takes back, and the power of the pin is fully restored. White pushed the pawn to d4, trying to open the way for the bishop to join the defense. But before that bishop can get involved, Black brings in another attacker by pushing f5. Even so, the bishop retreated to e2, and according to the engine, that was White's best defensive move. After that, Chigorin captured the pawn on e4. Now, the best way to stay in the game would have been to retreat the knight to h2, trying to give some cover to the king. But unfortunately, the knight went to d2 instead, which turned out to be the decisive mistake. Because after that, the bishops were traded and the queen moved to g5 with check. The king had no choice but to go to the h-file, to h1 for example. And then came the decisive blow, rook to f4, leaving no way to stop mate on h4. That's why White resigned. This shows how important it was for the knight to retreat to h2 instead of d2. As we've seen, Chigorin clearly understood the attacking concepts we've been working on in this class. In fact, I started learning them myself through these examples, and I hope now you do too. That wraps up today's lesson. I hope you're ready for the next one, because we're going to take things up a notch and dive even deeper into the attacking plans we need to learn from the Italian opening. Hope you enjoyed it. See you in the next video.